Thrift by Samuel Smiles. Chapter 2, Habits of Thrift. We begin with 4 quotations. Die Hauptsache ist, dass man lerne sich selbst zu beherrschen. The great matter is to learn to rule oneself. Goethe. Most men work for the present, a few for the future. The wise work for both, for the future in the present and for the present in the future. Guesses at Truth. The secret of all success is to know how to deny yourself. If you once learn to get the whip hand of yourself, that is the best educator. Prove to me that you can control yourself, and I'll say you're an educated man. And without this, all other education is good for next to nothing. Mrs. Oliphant. All the world cries, "Where is the man who will save us? We want a man." Don't look so far for this man. You have him at hand. This man, it is you, it is I, it is each of us. How to constitute oneself a man? Nothing harder if one knows not how to will it, nothing easier if one wills it. Alexander Dumas. Competence and comfort lie within the reach of most people, were they to take the adequate means to secure and enjoy them. Men who are paid good wages might also become capitalists and take their fair share in the improvement and well-being of the world. But it is only by the exercise of labor, energy, honesty, and thrift that they can advance their own position or that of their class. Society at present suffers far more from waste of money than from want of money. It is easier to make money than to know how to spend it. It is not what a man gets that constitutes his wealth, but his manner of spending and economizing. And when a man obtains by his labor more than enough for his personal and family wants, and can lay by a little store of savings besides, he unquestionably possesses the elements of social well-being. The savings may amount to little, but they may be sufficient to make him independent. There is no reason why the highly paid workman of today may not save a store of capital. It is merely a matter of self-denial and private economy. Indeed, the principal industrial leaders of today consist for the most part of men who have sprung directly from the ranks. It is the accumulation of experience and skill that makes the difference between the workman and the no-workman, and it depends upon the workman himself whether he will save his capital or waste it. If he save it, he will always find that he has sufficient opportunities for employing it profitably and usefully. "When I was down in Lancashire the other day," said Mr. Cobden to his fellow townsmen at Midhurst, "I visited a mill in company with some other gentlemen, and that mill belonged to a person whose real name I will not mention, but whom for the present purpose I will call Mr. Smith. There could not have been less than 3,000 or 4,000 persons engaged in this mill when it was at work, and there were 700 power looms under one roof. As we were coming away, one of the friends who accompanied me patted the owner of the mill on the shoulder, and with that frank and manly familiarity which rather distinguishes the Lancashire race, he said, 'Mr. Smith was a working man himself 25 years ago, and he owes all this entirely to his own industry and frugality.' To which Mr. Smith immediately replied, in the same frank and good-humored manner, 'Nay, I do not owe it all to myself. I married a wife with a fortune, for she was earning 9 shillings 6 a week as a weaver at the power loom when she married me.' Thrift of time is equal to thrift of money. Franklin said, 'Time is gold.' If one wishes to earn money, it may be done by the proper use of time. But time may also be spent in doing many good and noble actions. It may be spent in learning, in study, in art, in science, in literature. Time can be economized by system. System is an arrangement to secure certain ends so that no time may be lost in accomplishing them. Every businessman must be systematic and orderly, so must every housewife. There must be a place for everything and everything in its place. There must also be a time for everything, and everything must be done in time. It is not necessary to show that economy is useful. Nobody denies that thrift may be practiced. We see numerous examples of it. What many men have already done, all other men may do. Nor is thrift a painful virtue. On the contrary, it enables us to avoid much contempt and many indignities. It requires us to deny ourselves, but not to abstain from any proper enjoyment. It provides many honest pleasures, of which thriftlessness and extravagance deprive us. Let no man say that he cannot economize. There are few persons who could not contrive to save a few shillings weekly. In 20 years, 3 shillings saved weekly would amount to £240, and in 10 years more, by addition of interest, to £420. Some may say that they cannot save nearly so much. Well, begin with 2 shillings, 1 shilling, or even 6pence. Begin somewhere, but at all events make a beginning. 6pence a week, deposited in the savings bank, will amount to £40 in 20 years, and £70 in 30 years. It is the habit of economizing and denying oneself that needs to be formed. Thrift does not require superior courage, nor superior intellect, nor any superhuman virtue. It merely requires common sense and the power of resisting selfish enjoyments. In fact, thrift is merely common sense in everyday working action. It needs no fervent resolution, but only a little patient self-denial. Begin is its device. The more the habit of thrift is practiced, the easier it becomes, and the sooner it compensates the self-denier from the sacrifices which it has imposed. The question may be asked, is it possible for a man working for small wages to save anything and lay it by in a savings bank when he requires every penny for the maintenance of his family? But the fact remains that it is done by many industrious and sober men, that they do deny themselves and put their spare earnings into savings banks and the other receptacles provided for poor men's savings. And if some can do this, all may do it under similar circumstances, without depriving themselves of any genuine pleasure or any real enjoyment. How intensely selfish it is for a person in the receipt of good pay to spend everything upon himself, or if he has a family, to spend the whole earnings from week to week and lay nothing by. When we hear that a man who has been in the receipt of a good salary has died and left nothing behind himself, that he has left his wife and family destitute, left them to chance, to live or perish anywhere, we cannot but regard it as the most selfish thriftlessness. And yet comparatively little is thought of such cases. Perhaps the hat goes round, subscriptions may produce something, perhaps nothing, and the ruined remnants of the unhappy family sink into poverty and destitution. Yet the merest prudence would to a great extent have obviated this result. The curtailment of any sensual or selfish enjoyment, of a glass of beer or a screw of tobacco, would enable a man in the course of years to save at least something for others instead of wasting it on himself. It is, in fact, the absolute duty of the poorest man to provide in however slight a degree for the support of himself and his family in the season of sickness and helplessness which often comes upon men when they least expect such a visitation. Comparatively few people can be rich, but most have it in their power to acquire, by industry and economy, sufficient to meet their personal wants. They may even become the possessor of savings sufficient to secure them against penury and poverty in their old age. It is not, however, the want of opportunity, but the want of will that stands in the way of economy. Men may labor unceasingly with hand or head, but they cannot abstain from spending too freely and living too highly. The majority prefer the enjoyment of pleasure to the practice of self-denial. With the mass of men, the animal is paramount. They often spend all that they earn. But it is not merely the working people who are spendthrifts. We hear of men who for years have been earning and spending hundreds a year, who suddenly die, leaving their children penniless. Everybody knows of such cases. At their death, the very furniture of the house they have lived in belongs to others. It is sold to pay their funeral expenses and debts which they have incurred during their thriftless lifetime. Money represents a multitude of objects without value or without real utility, but it also represents something much more precious, and that is independence. In this light, it is of great moral importance. As a guarantee of independence, the modest and plebeian quality of economy is at once ennobled and raised to the rank of one of the most meritorious of virtues. "Never treat money affairs with levity," said Bulwer. "Money is character." Some of man's best qualities depend upon the right use of money, such as his generosity, benevolence, justice, honesty, and forethought. Many of his worst qualities also originate in the bad use of money, such as greed, miserliness, injustice, extravagance, and improvidence. No class ever accomplished anything that lived from hand to mouth. People who spend all that they earn are ever hanging on the brink of destitution. They must necessarily be weak and impotent, the slaves of time and circumstance. They keep themselves poor. They lose self-respect as well as the respect of others. It is impossible that they can be free and independent. To be thriftless is enough to deprive one of all manly spirit and virtue. But a man with something saved, no matter how little, is in a different position. The little capital he has stored up is always a source of power. He is no longer the sport of time and fate. He can boldly look the world in the face. He is, in a manner, his own master. He can dictate his own terms. He can neither be bought nor sold. He can look forward with cheerfulness to an old age of comfort and happiness. As men become wise and thoughtful, they generally become provident and frugal. A thoughtless man, like a savage, spends as he gets, thinking nothing of tomorrow, of the time of adversity, or of the claims of those whom he has made dependent on him. But a wise man thinks of the future. He prepares in good time for the evil day that may come upon him and his family, and he provides carefully for those who are near and dear to him. What a serious responsibility does the man incur who marries! Not many seriously think of this responsibility. Perhaps this is wisely ordered, for much serious thinking might end in the avoidance of married life and its responsibilities. But once married, a man ought forthwith to determine that so far as his own efforts are concerned, want shall never enter his household, and that his children shall not, in the event of his being removed from the scene of life and labor, be left a burthen upon society. Economy with this object is an important duty. Without economy, no man can be just, no man can be honest. Improvidence is cruelty to women and children, though the cruelty is born of ignorance. A father spends his surplus means in drink, providing little and saving nothing, and then he dies, leaving his destitute family his lifelong victims. Can any form of cruelty surpass this? Yet this reckless course is pursued to a large extent among every class. The middle and upper classes are equally guilty with the lower classes. They live beyond their means. They live extravagantly. They are ambitious of glare and glitter, frivolity and pleasure. They struggle to be rich, that they may have the means of spending, of drinking rich wines, and giving good dinners. When Mr. Hume said in the House of Commons some years ago that the tone of living in England was altogether too high, his observation was followed with loud laughter. Yet his remark was perfectly true. It is far more true now than it was then. Thinking people believe that life is now too fast, and that we are living at high pressure. In short, we live extravagantly. We live beyond our means. We throw away our earnings, and often throw our lives after them. Many persons are diligent enough in making money, but do not know how to economize it, or how to spend it. They have sufficient skill and industry to do the one, but they want the necessary wisdom to do the other. The temporary passion for enjoyment seizes us, and we give way to it without regard to consequences. And yet it may be merely the result of forgetfulness, and might be easily controlled by firmness of will and by energetic resolution to avoid the occasional causes of expenditure for the future. The habit of saving arises, for the most part, in the desire to ameliorate our social condition, as well as to ameliorate the condition of those who are dependent upon us. It dispenses with everything which is not essential, and avoids all methods of living that are wasteful and extravagant. A purchase made at the lowest price will be dear if it be a superfluity. Little expenses lead to great. Buying things that are not wanted soon accustoms us to prodigality in other respects. Cicero said, "Not to have a mania for buying is to possess a revenue." Many are carried away by the habit of bargain buying. Here is something wonderfully cheap. Let us buy it. Have you any use for it? No, not at present, but it is sure to come in useful sometime. Fashion runs in this habit of buying. Some buy old china, as much as will furnish a china shop. Others buy old pictures, old furniture, old wines, all great bargains. There would be little harm in buying these old things if they were not so often bought at the expense of the connoisseur's creditors. Horace Walpole once said, "I hope that there will not be another sale, for I have not an inch of room nor a farthing left." Men must prepare in youth and in middle age the means of enjoying old age pleasantly and happily. There can be nothing more distressing than to see an old man, who has spent the greater part of his life in well-paid-for labor, reduced to the necessity of begging for bread, and relying entirely on the commiseration of his neighbors or upon the bounty of strangers. Such a consideration as this should inspire men in early life with a determination to work and to save for the benefit of themselves and their families in later years. It is, in fact, in youth that economy should be practiced, and in old age that men should dispense liberally, provided they do not exceed their income. The young man has a long future before him, during which he may exercise the principles of economy, whilst the other is reaching the end of his career and can carry nothing out of the world with him. This, however, is not the usual practice. The young man now spends, or desires to spend, quite as liberally, and often much more liberally than his father, who is about to end his career. He begins life where his father left off. He spends more than his father did at his age, and soon finds himself up to his ears in debt. To satisfy his incessant wants, he resorts to unscrupulous means and to illicit gains. He tries to make money rapidly. He speculates, overtrades, and is speedily wound up. Thus he obtains experience, but it is the result not of well-doing, but of ill-doing. Socrates recommends fathers of families to observe the practice of their thrifty neighbors, of those who spend their means to the best advantage, and to profit by their example. Thrift is essentially practical, and can best be taught by facts. Two men earn, say, 5 shillings a day. They are in precisely the same condition as respects family living and expenditure. Yet the one says he cannot save, and does not, while the other says he can save, and regularly deposits part of his savings in the savings bank, and eventually becomes a capitalist. Samuel Johnson fully knew the straits of poverty. He once signed his name Imprunus, or dinnerless. He had walked the streets with Savage, not knowing where to lay his head at night. Johnson never forgot the poverty through which he passed in his early life, and he was always counseling his friends and readers to avoid it. Like Cicero, he averred that the best source of wealth or well-being was economy. He called it the daughter of prudence, the sister of temperance, and the mother of liberty. His mind, his character, self-respect originating in self-love, instigates the first step of improvement. It stimulates a man to rise, to look upward, to develop his intelligence, to improve his condition. Self-respect is the root of most of the virtues, of cleanliness, chastity, reverence, honesty, sobriety. To think meanly of oneself is to sink, sometimes to descend a precipice at the bottom of which is infamy. Every man can help himself to some extent. We are not mere straws thrown upon a current to mark its course, but possessed of freedom of action, endowed with power to stem the waves and rise above them, each marking out a course for himself. We can each elevate ourselves in the scale of moral being. We can cherish pure thoughts. We can perform good actions. We can live soberly and frugally. We can provide against the evil day. We can read good books, listen to wise teachers, and place ourselves under the divinest influences on earth. We can live for the highest purposes and with the highest aims in life. Self-love and social are the same, says one of our poets. The man who improves himself improves the world. He adds one more true man to the mass. And the mass being made up of individuals, it is clear that were each to improve himself, the result would be the improvement of the whole. Social advancement is the consequence of individual advancement. The whole cannot be pure unless the individuals composing it are pure. Society at large is but a reflection of individual conditions. All this is but the repetition of a truism, but truisms have often to be repeated to make their full impression. Then again, a man, when he has improved himself, is better able to improve those who are brought into contact with him. He has more power. His sphere of vision is enlarged. He sees more clearly the defects in the condition of others that might be remedied. He can lend a more active helping hand to raise them. He has done his duty by himself, and can with more authority urge upon others the necessity of doing the like duty to themselves. How can a man be a social elevator who is himself walking in the mire of self-indulgence? How can he teach sobriety or cleanliness if he be himself drunken or foul? Physician, heal thyself, is the answer of his neighbors. The sum and substance of our remarks is this. In all the individual reforms or improvements that we desire, we must begin with ourselves. We must exhibit our gospel in our own life. We must teach by our own example. If we would have others elevated, we must elevate ourselves. Each man can exhibit the results in his own person. He can begin with self-respect. The uncertainty of life is a strong inducement to provide against the evil day. To do this is a moral and social as well as a religious duty. Quote, "He that provideth not for his own, and especially for those of his own household, hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel." End quote. The uncertainty of life is proverbially true. The strongest and healthiest man may be stricken down in a moment by accident or disease. If we take human life in the mass, we cannot fail to recognize the uncertainty of life as much as we do the certainty of death. There is a striking passage in Addison's Vision of Mirza, in which life is pictured as a passage over a bridge of about 100 arches. A black cloud hangs over each end of the bridge. At the entrance to it there are hidden pitfalls very thickly set, through which the throngs disappear so soon as they have placed their feet upon the bridge. They grow thinner towards the center, they gradually disappear, until at length only a few persons reach the further side. And these also, having dropped through the pitfalls, the bridge at its further extremity becomes entirely clear. The description of Addison corresponds with the results of the observations made as to the duration of human life. Thus, of 100,000 persons born in this country, it has been ascertained that a fourth of them die before they have reached their 5th year, and 1/2 before they have reached their 50th year. 1,100 will reach their 90th year. 16 will live to 100. And only 2 persons out of the 100,000 like the last barks of an innumerable convoy, will reach the advanced and helpless age of 105 years. Two things are very obvious: the uncertainty as to the hour of death in individuals, but the regularity and constancy of the circumstances which influence the duration of human life in the aggregate. It is a matter of certainty that the average life of all persons born in this country extends to about 45 years. This has been proved by a very large number of observations of human life and its duration. Equally extensive observations have been made as to the average number of persons of various ages who die yearly. It is always the number of the experiments which gives the law of probability. It is on such observations that the actuary founds his estimates of the mortality that exists at any given period of life. The actuary tells you that he has been guided by the laws of mortality. Now, the results must be very regular to justify the actuary in speaking of mortality as governed by laws, and yet it is so. Indeed, there would seem to be no such thing as chance in the world. Man lives and dies in conformity to a law. A sparrow falls to the ground in obedience to a law. Nay, there are matters in the ordinary transactions of life, such as one might suppose were the mere result of chance, which are ascertained to be of remarkable accuracy when taken in the mass. For instance, the number of letters put in the post office without an address, the number of letters wrongly directed, the number containing money, the number unstamped, continue nearly the same in relation to the number of letters posted from one year to another. Now, it is the business of man to understand the laws of health and to provide against their consequences, as, for instance, in the matter of sickness, accident, and premature death. We cannot escape the consequences of transgression of natural laws, though we may have meant well. We must have done well. The Creator does not alter his laws to accommodate them to our ignorance. He has furnished us with intelligence, so that we may understand them and act upon them, otherwise we must suffer the consequences in inevitable pain and sorrow. We often hear the cry raised, "Will nobody help us?" It is a spiritless, hopeless cry. It is sometimes a cry of revolting meanness, especially when it issues from those who, with a little self-denial, sobriety, and thrift, might easily help themselves. Many people have yet to learn that virtue, knowledge, freedom, and prosperity must spring from themselves. Legislation can do very little for them. It cannot make them sober, intelligent, and well-doing. The prime miseries of most men have their origin in causes far removed from acts of Parliament. The spendthrift laughs at legislation, the drunkard defies it, and arrogates the right of dispensing with forethought and self-denial, throwing upon others the blame for his ultimate wretchedness. The mob orators who gather the millions about them are very wide of the mark, when instead of seeking to train their crowd of hearers to habits of frugality, temperance, and self-culture, they encourage them to keep up the cry, "Will nobody help us?" The cry sickens the soul. It shows gross ignorance of the first elements of personal welfare. Help is in men themselves. They were born to help and to elevate themselves. They must work out their own salvation. The poorest men have done it. Why should not every man do it? The brave, upward spirit ever conquers. The number of well-paid workmen in this country has become very large, who might easily save and economize to the improvement of their moral well-being, of their respectability and independence, and of their status in society as men and citizens. They are improvident and thriftless to an extent which proves not less hurtful to their personal happiness and domestic comfort than it is injurious to the society of which they form so important a part. In prosperous times they spend their gains recklessly, and when adverse times come, they are at once plunged in misery. Money is not used but abused, and when wage-earning people should be providing against old age or for the wants of a growing family, they are in too many cases feeding folly, dissipation, and vice. Let no one say that this is an exaggerated picture. It is enough to look around any neighborhood and see how much is spent and how little is saved, what a large proportion of earnings go to the beer shop and how little to the savings bank or the benefit society. Prosperous times are very often the least prosperous of all times. In prosperous times, mills are working full-time, men, women, and children are paid high wages, warehouses are emptied and filled, goods are manufactured and exported, wherries full of produce pass along the streets, immense luggage trains run along the railways, and heavily laden ships leave our shores daily for foreign ports full of the products of our industry. Everybody seems to be becoming richer and more prosperous. But we do not think of whether men and women are becoming wiser, better trained, less self-indulgent, more religiously disposed, or living for any higher purpose than the satisfaction of the animal appetite. If this apparent prosperity be closely examined, it will be found that expenditure is increasing in all directions. There are demands for higher wages, and the higher wages, when obtained, are spent as soon as earned. Intemperate habits are formed, and once formed, the habit of intemperance continues. Increased wages, instead of being saved, are for the most part spent in drink. Thus, when a population is thoughtless and improvident, no kind of material prosperity will benefit them. Unless they exercise forethought and economy, they will alternately be in a state of hunger and burst. When trade falls off, as it usually does after exceptional prosperity, they will not be comforted by the thought of what they might have saved had it ever occurred to them that the prosperous times might not have proved permanent. During prosperous times, Saint Monday is regularly observed. The bank holiday is repeated weekly. "Where are all the workmen?" said a master to his foreman on going the rounds among his builders. "This work must be pushed on and covered in while the fine weather lasts." "Why, sir," said the foreman, "this is Monday, and they have not spent all their money yet." Dean Boyd, preaching at Exeter on behalf of the Devonshire hospitals, expressed his belief that the annual loss to the workpeople engaged in the woolen manufacture, the cotton trade, the bricklaying and building trade, by idle Monday, amounted to over 7 millions sterling. If man's chief end were to manufacture cloth, silk, cotton, hardware, toys, and china, to buy in the cheapest market and to sell in the dearest, to cultivate land, grow corn, and graze cattle, to live for mere money profit, and hoard or spend as the case might be, we might then congratulate ourselves upon our national prosperity. But is this the chief end of man? Has he not faculties, affections, and sympathies besides muscular organs? Has not his mind and heart certain claims, as well as his mouth and his back? Has he not a soul as well as a stomach? And ought not prosperity to include the improvement and well-being of his morals and intellect, as well as of his bones and muscles? Mere money is no indication of prosperity. A man's nature may remain the same. It may even grow more stunted and deformed while he is doubling his expenditure or adding cent per cent to his hoards yearly. It is the same with the mass. The increase of their gains may merely furnish them with increased means for gratifying animal indulgences, unless their moral character keeps pace with their physical advancement. Double the gains of an uneducated, overworked man in time of prosperity, and what is the result? Simply that you have furnished him with the means of eating and drinking more. Thus, not even the material well-being of the population is secured by that condition of things which is defined by political economists as national prosperity. And so long as the moral elements of the question are ignored, this kind of prosperity is, we believe, calculated to produce far more mischievous results than good. It is knowledge and virtue alone that can confer dignity on a man's life, and the growth of such qualities in a nation are the only true marks of its real prosperity, not the infinite manufacture and sale of cotton prints, toys, hardware, and crockery. The Bishop of Manchester, when preaching at a harvest thanksgiving near Preston, referred to a letter which he had received from a clergyman in the south of England, who, after expressing his pleasure at the fact that the agricultural laborers were receiving higher wages, lamented, quote, that at present the only result he could discover from their higher wages was that a great deal more beer was consumed. If this was the use we are making of this prosperity, we could hardly call it a blessing for which we had a right or ground to thank God. The true prosperity of the nation consisted not so much in the fact that the nation was growing in wealth, though wealth was a necessary attribute of prosperity, but that it was growing in virtue, and that there was a more equable distribution of comfort, contentment, and the things of this lower world. End quote. In making the preceding observations, we do not in the least advocate the formation of miserly, penurious habits, for we hate the scrub, the screw, the miser. All that we contend for is that man should provide for the future, that they should provide during good times for the bad times which almost invariably follow them, that they should lay by a store of savings as a breakwater against want, and make sure of a little fund which may maintain them in their old age, secure their self-respect, and add to their personal comfort and social well-being. Thrift is not in any way connected with avarice, usury, greed, or selfishness. It is, in fact, the very reverse of these disgusting dispositions. It means economy for the purpose of securing independence. Thrift requires that money should be used and not abused, that it should be honestly earned and economically employed. Quote, not for to put it in a hedge, not for a train attendant, but for the glorious privilege of being independent. End quote. End of section 2.